People sometimes ask whether I'm mainly a classical or a jazz musician, and I really don't know what to tell them because it's basically 50-50. Uh, I pretty much play symphonic music, chamber music, the occasional solo, although I'm not primarily a soloist. But I also play a lot of jazz. I've always played jazz, and I played early jazz, swing, uh, some bebop and progressive jazz, that sort of thing, and big bands, small groups, uh, some solo playing. And I really can't tell you whether I'm primarily a classical or a jazz player. It's really 50-50 right down the middle, both in terms of what I like to do and what I'm good at. How did this happen? Well, it's probably because I was exposed to a lot of different types of music right from the beginning when I was growing up. My parents had a very eclectic record collection, and as soon as I was old enough to work the phonograph, they let me listen to basically whatever I wanted to. And we went to a lot of concerts and jazz clubs and musical performances of all kinds. But I think the most important thing really was the record collection. So I have a number of records that I saved from my parents' record collection that were kind of important to me when I was growing up. And I'd like to share some of them with you to give you an idea of sort of what goes into the development of a well-rounded musician. I'm going to start with the one that really started it all. And this was pretty mainstream recording, The Four Seasons by Vivaldi, which is kind of a cliche by today's standards, but I learned this piece when one day, my recollection is that my mother was doing some housework one day when I was home. I was probably 6 years old, and while she was working around the house, she put this record on, and just from the first moment I heard it, I was absolutely hooked. It blew my mind completely. I couldn't believe these beautiful sounds I was hearing. I had actually been kind of a rock and roll listener as a kid. I grew up listening to WRKO, the Dale Dorman Show, and sort of top 40 music of the late 60s or so, and that's kind of what I liked. But as soon as I heard Vivaldi, there was no going back. I was just all about the classics. And this particular recording, I've just I always, well, with the cover art, I just kept going back to it in the record collection and listening to it over and over and over again. Guido Cantelli with the Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra of New York, which is the old name for the New York Philharmonic. Kind of a not really the original instruments movement or the historic informed performance movement. It was more of a classical rendition of Vivaldi, but it was just beautiful, and that really got me started listening to classical music and orchestral music generally. After that, I was all about listening to orchestral music. Another one with some fairly early music, Telemann, the Suite in A minor for flute and strings, and some Mozart. Particularly, I think we got this one for the flute suite because the flute soloist is James Paputsakis, who at the time was with the Boston Symphony, and he was with the Boston Symphony Orchestra for many years. He was always one of our favorites, and this was another recording that got me interested in Baroque music and orchestral music. But as I started to delve more into the record collection, the composer that really hit me, you will not be surprised to learn, was Beethoven. This set here, Beethoven's First and Ninth Symphonies, conducted by Arturo Toscanini with the NBC Symphony. This is an absolute classic from the 50s, I think, and you can see these pictures of Toscanini on the cover. They sort of attracted me to listen to the record, and I listened to this over and over again. We also had a Beethoven 9 on 78s by Eugene Ormandy, and I still have that one somewhere. But the first and the ninth symphony kind of brackets the universe of Beethoven's orchestral output, and after that there was no going back. I just was all about learning the Beethoven symphonies, and I knew them like the back of my hand from the time I was 8 or 9 years old. They were just part and parcel of what I wanted to listen to as often as I could. Here's another Beethoven recording, also from my parents' record collection. This is the Emperor Concerto number 5 in E flat with Walter Gieseking and Herbert von Karajan and the Philharmonia Orchestra. I think this is from 1951. This one is another recording that I just listened to many times, probably dozens of times, and I just fell in love with Beethoven's orchestral writing during that period of my life. Also, other types of orchestral music slightly earlier. Haydn, again with Toscanini. This was a favorite when I was in the elementary school age range. The Surprise Symphony and the Clock Symphony, two of his most famous symphonic works. Felix Weingartner with the Brahms First Symphony. This was another recording that I can't tell you how many times I listened to this. Dozens and dozens of times probably as I was growing up. I became enamored of the bigger sound of the 19th century orchestra as written by Brahms, with this performance by Felix Weingartner. He was Mahler's successor at the Vienna Court Opera when Mahler left the opera in 1907 to go to New York. Weingartner made this recording in either the late 30s or the early 40s with the London Symphony. It was part of a complete Brahms cycle that he did, all of which you can get, and I strongly recommend those because they're excellent recordings. Another one by Toscanini that I liked growing up was the Mozart Jupiter Symphony, which is it's Mozart's last symphony, and it's almost like Beethoven. It's a big orchestra. It's really forward-looking. It's an exciting piece. It's almost 40 minutes long, and it's really powerful music for considering it was written in the late 18th century. It was a very forward-looking piece, and it kind of foreshadows what Mozart might have written if he had lived longer, since he died at the age of 35. If he had lived to Beethoven's age of 56, it's hard to imagine he just might have written symphonies much more like Beethoven, as I think he started to do with the Jupiter Symphony. On the other side of this record is the Mozart Bassoon Concerto, which was a piece that I also became very familiar with, and later on in life I would learn how to play it as a trombone solo, which actually works surprisingly well. The soloist was in this case is Leonard Sharrow with the NBC Symphony. I think Leonard Sharrow was the principal bassoon of the New York Philharmonic, but don't quote me on that because I might be wrong about that. Speaking of trombone solos, I'm including this record even though it was purchased later. This is the Rimsky-Korsakov Trombone Concerto, and that was actually the first solo that I really of any significance that I learned when I was studying trombone as a junior high or a high school kid. This concerto was really exciting to me because it sort of opened my ears to what could be done with the solo trombone. This is an old Soviet-era recording of wind ensemble pieces with Rimsky-Korsakov, some music by Tchaikovsky, and also Prokofiev by the Soviet Defense Ministry band under an old Melodia Angel recording. To continue in the Russian vein, we had this recording of the Stravinsky Firebird Suite and the Mussorgsky Pictures at an Exhibition. These are by the Philadelphia Orchestra with Eugene Ormandy. I grew these were really exciting pieces. Actually, I remember the Firebird Suite from an old TV program by Seiji Ozawa with the Boston Symphony. They used to have in the 70s there was a program called Evening at Symphony that it was an hour-long program of symphonic music, and I remember a very exciting performance of the Firebird Suite by Seiji Ozawa with the Boston Symphony. That was an exciting time to be growing up as a classical music listener. Ozawa had some really exciting performances, and that Evening at Symphony series wasn't on for very long. I think it was only on for a year or two. I think it was an outgrowth of the Evening at Pops program, which has been going on or went on for at least 20 or 30 years. At one point they decided to delve into more of a straight symphony program with the Evening at Symphony on Channel 2, and I used to look forward to those every week. They were great programs, and but I also remember this recording of the Stravinsky Firebird Suite, and also the pictures at an exhibition, which I used as a way of learning the piece when my high school band played. We played a transcription of The Great Gate at Kiev. Anyway, these will give you an idea of some of the sort of the 19th and 20th century repertoire that I was exposed to through the record collection that I had at home. We also had a lot of Bach. There's a tremendous amount of Bach in the collection. This was an example, the Prads Festival of 1950, which was a chamber music festival organized by Pablo Casals, and he did this for many years. This particular recording is the first 3 Brandenburg concertos, and it's particularly notable for the fact that on the second Brandenburg concerto, the trumpet part is actually played by a soprano saxophone, which works surprisingly well. It's something that I didn't quite realize until sometime later, that it was a soprano saxophone and not a trumpet. But some really fantastic musicians on this recording: Alexander Schneider, Marcel Tabuteau. Marcel Mule was the soprano saxophone soloist, and this Prads Festival Orchestra under Pablo Casals. Some of the more specialized music that I became interested in included organ music, and I've always been a fan of organ music. I go to organ recitals a lot of the time, and I like to play music with trombone and organ in church services. And one of the reasons for that was that in the record library as I was growing up, we had several of these recordings by André Marchal in a series called The Art of André Marchal. These were recorded at MIT. I've sort of had a lifelong love affair with the classical guitar, which started when my dad used to study classical guitar a little bit in the 70s when I was growing up. And one of the records that we had that I remember listening to is this one, An Evening with Andres Segovia, in which he plays really an excellent selection of mostly early music. This is an old recording from the 50s, I think, when he was a little bit younger and really in excellent form at this time. Doesn't say exactly when this was recorded, but probably in the 50s or the early 60s. And my dad and I saw Segovia in live performance at Symphony Hall in 1980, and I remember that he was still, he was quite old by then, but he was still an excellent player and really a showman. He really played to the crowd, and he was very aware of the effect that he was having on the crowd. In Symphony Hall, it's a big concert hall, and you would think that a solo classical guitar might be difficult to hear or difficult to hold the audience's attention in such a large space, but not at all. Segovia just held everybody wrapped around his little finger the whole time, and he kept our attention, and he played 3 encores, the last of which I recall was the Prelude in E minor by Villa-Lobos. Anyway, I've always been interested in classical guitar, and I'm indebted to a lot of the records we had, that most of which my dad had, including this one right here. This is another one also featuring the guitar. This is not the original record that I grew up with. We actually had this recording is called Conversations with the Guitar. It's by the Brazilian guitarist Laurindo Almeida, and the record is duets with a mezzo-soprano, a viola, a flute, and a clarinet, playing different types of Brazilian music, folk music and classical music. We originally had this recording on an 8-track tape that we used to listen to in our 66 Lincoln Continental that we had in the 70s. I remember we always used to, we had the Laurindo Almeida, we had one of John Williams playing Villa-Lobos, we had Caruso singing Italian opera, all sorts of things, Phil Wood. Anyway, this Conversations with the Guitar was, and still is, one of my favorite guitar recordings. Back in the, I think the late 40s, these famous Norman Granz Jazz at the Philharmonic recordings were made. These were from live jam sessions, sort of a concert tour, I think, on the West Coast. And there were many famous musicians on these records. This particular one features Charlie Ventura, Charlie Parker, Willie Smith, Lester Young, Shoeless Joe Jackson on piano, and John Burks, otherwise known as Dizzy Gillespie. And here's the, you might be interested in this picture of Dizzy Gillespie on the right side. He doesn't have the angled trumpet that he had later on, but this is some fabulous music. When I was young, I didn't really understand what jazz was. My parents didn't really tell me too much about it, but as I say, they allowed me to dig into the record library whenever I wanted. So I just found stuff I liked and listened to it. Here's another one. This is volume 2 of the Jazz at the Philharmonic series. This one features one of my all-time favorite trumpet players, Howard McGhee. Howard McGhee was a sort of a kind of a swing player early in his career, but then he became he was one of the few guys that successfully adapted to the bebop and post-bop style. You can listen to some of his later recordings for examples of that. Also, Willie Smith and Charlie Parker are both also on this recording, as is Lester Young. And Arnold Ross on piano, Billy Hadnot on bass, and the drummer is Lee Young of the West Coast, I guess from the Lionel Hampton Band. Anyway, this was another recording that I listened to many times as I was growing up, and it was an influential part of my development as a jazz listener. Dave Brubeck. I think I probably heard Dave Brubeck more times than any other jazz player, not counting sort of maybe a few local musicians in Boston. We saw him at Symphony Hall many times. We saw him at Tanglewood. We saw him, I saw him at the Newport Jazz Festival, I think, and we saw him at the Syracuse Jazz Festival. My parents and I saw him many times at Symphony Hall when he came through touring. Here's another one, Jazz Goes to Junior College. This was recorded on the West Coast. This is a slightly earlier recording of the Dave Brubeck Quartet. Let me just check the personnel on this one. This is with pretty much the classic Dave Brubeck Quartet. Paul Desmond on alto sax, Norman Bates on bass, and Joe Morello on drums. This was recorded at Long Beach Junior College, a couple of junior colleges, Fullerton and Long Beach Junior College in California. This one was always in the the record library as far back as I can remember. Here's another one of my absolute all-time favorite musicians, Errol Garner. This recording, Gone Garner Gonest, was another one that I listened to many times over and over. Really just a utterly unique player. You can recognize him instantly. Many pianists have been influenced by Errol Garner, but he himself is immediately recognizable. This was another one, the Jerry Mulligan Paul Desmond Quartet. This was a quartet without piano, just bass and drums. And just one more that I pulled out, Maynard Ferguson Big Band, Come Blow Your Horn. This was one of the records that got me interested in being a horn player. Lots of big loud brass and some terrific writing on this album, and Maynard Ferguson really in the prime of his career, in the probably in the late 50s, early 60s. Not sure exactly, but anyway, this was some of Maynard Ferguson's best work. Anyway, that's how I got involved in having sort of a wide range of musical taste in both classical and jazz. Basically just from having a chance to just delve into the record library and listen to whatever I wanted as soon as I was able to use the machine. So that's what it's all about. Just listen to everything you can find, and good music is where you find it.